participating in a long-distance swimming competition, miles from shore, surrounded by open ocean. A dorsal fin sliced through the water nearby. Panic spread through the group of swimmers, thrashing and screaming as the massive predator attacked. One by one, they disappeared beneath the waves. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the Orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The Pacific Dream was a luxury cruise ship, a gleaming white vessel that glided across the waters of British Columbia's coast with ease. A group of tourists, eager to witness the wonders of the Pacific, filled the deck, snapping photos of the rugged cliffs and dense forests that bordered the serene waters. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. It seemed like the perfect day for a whale-watching excursion. Captain John Davis stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had sailed these waters for decades and was used to the occasional sighting of orcas, gray whales, or humpbacks. Today, though, something felt different. He couldn't quite place it, but a quiet unease crept into his chest as he watched the rolling waves. "Looks like we'll get a good view today," First Mate Sarah Peterson said from beside him. She was young, sharp, and eager, with a steady hand on the wheel. Her voice was calm, but her eyes darted nervously to the water every now and then. She too had spent countless hours at sea, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. "You know, we've been lucky this season," Davis replied, his voice gruff. "We've had some great sightings. It's always a thrill to see those pods." "Yeah," Sarah muttered, her gaze focused on the vast expanse of water. "But today it just feels off." Davis glanced at her, noting her tense posture. "You sure you're all right, Sarah?" She gave him a tight smile. "Just feeling a bit on edge, that's all." "I'll be fine." The tourists were gathered near the observation deck, chattering excitedly as the ship neared a known orca habitat. The crew had already warned them to keep a safe distance, to respect the wildlife, and above all, not to engage. These were wild creatures, not trained performers, and they could be unpredictable. The first sighting came within an hour of the ship's departure. A few dorsal fins broke the surface in the distance. The crowd erupted into cheers, cameras clicking as everyone rushed to the railing. Sarah stepped forward, squinting into the distance. It was a large pod, at least a dozen orcas, their black fins cutting through the water like sleek knives. "They're coming closer," Sarah said, her voice tight. She turned to Davis. "Let's slow down a bit. Give them some space." Davis nodded and gave the order to slow the ship, the engines humming quieter as the boat drifted. He'd seen these creatures before, majestic, powerful, and deadly in their own right. But something about the way the pod moved today made him uneasy. They were circling, staying closer to the boat than usual. As the ship slowed, the orcas began to approach with increasing speed, their sleek bodies rising and falling with the waves. "That's unusual," Sarah muttered, eyeing the pod. With suspicion, "They usually keep their distance." Davis nodded. "Maybe they're just curious." But even as he said it, he didn't fully believe it. He knew these waters well enough to recognize when something was wrong. These animals were apex predators. Orcas weren't known for being aggressive toward boats, but they could be territorial. And he was starting to feel a tension in the air, something that settled deep in his gut. As the boat drifted closer, the orcas began to swim in tight circles around the hull, their black fins cutting through the water in a synchronized dance. It was mesmerizing, almost beautiful, but a sharp pang of fear lodged in Davis's chest. "They're not just circling," Sarah said, her voice quivering. "They're testing the boat." "Testing it?" Davis turned to her, brow furrowed. "They're ramming it," she replied, her voice low. "They're trying to see if it's weak." Low thud reverberated through the ship. The hull groaned as a powerful strike hit from beneath, followed by another, this time stronger. Water splashed against the side of the boat as the orcas struck again, their bodies powerful and intent. "Brace yourself," Davis shouted to the passengers, his calm facade shattering for the first time. The tourists scattered, some falling to the deck, others grabbing onto anything they could to steady themselves. Panic spread like wildfire as the sound of cracking wood filled the air. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah demanded, her face pale, as she gripped the railing. "Why are they doing this?" "I don't know," Davis muttered, his knuckles white on the wheel. "But we need to get out of here. Fast." The boat lurched to the side as another blow landed. This time, the sound of the strike was deeper, more resonant. Something in the hull gave way, the ship's integrity now compromised. The passengers screamed as the boat began to list. "Get to the lifeboats," Davis ordered, his voice hoarse, with urgency. "Get them ready now." Sarah darted into the crew area, grabbing the emergency gear. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The boat was sinking, no doubt about it. The Orcas were relentless, and they weren't stopping. Their attacks were precise and devastating, each strike calculated and forceful. As Sarah emerged from the crew quarters, she caught sight of the pod again. The Orcas were still circling, their black bodies rising out of the water as if they were judging the ship. It was like they were waiting for something. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they were waiting for, the right moment to strike again. "They're not just curious," she whispered to herself. "They're hunting." A loud crack echoed from the ship, and Sarah whipped around to see the side of the boat splintering. Water poured in, and the ship listed even further. The crew rushed to get the lifeboats into the water, but the Orcas didn't relent. Another strike hit, and the boat shuddered violently. A scream rang out as a passenger was thrown overboard, their body disappearing beneath the surface of the churning. "Sarah." "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing to the railing. She could barely make out the person's form in the dark water, but the Orcas were faster. One massive black and white shape shot toward the flailing figure, and then there was nothing. A thick, metallic taste filled Sarah's mouth as she turned away from the railing, tears stinging her eyes. It was happening too quickly. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing. "Help them!" a woman screamed, clutching her child. "Please!" "I'm trying," Sarah shouted, trying to keep calm. She yanked at the rope, struggling to lower the lifeboat into the water. The crew was scattered, some still trying to send out distress signals while others frantically worked to get the remaining passengers off the sinking ship. The Orcas were still circling, their sleek forms gliding just beneath the surface, barely visible. But Sarah knew they were waiting for the last of the survivors to make a move. They were hunting, and the boat was their prey. Davis stumbled across the deck, his face twisted with disbelief. "We need to go now. Get the last of them out." The boat shook violently again. Another strike. The ship was losing the fight, and everyone knew it. Panic consumed the remaining passengers as the crew struggled to keep control of the situation. Lifeboats were launched, some of them capsized under the force of the waves stirred up by the Orcas. The water around the ship turned dark as more bodies were tossed into the sea. "We're not going to make it," Sarah whispered to herself as she helped an elderly couple into the last remaining lifeboat. The chaos was overwhelming. She was exhausted, her heart racing, but there was no time to rest. Not now. Not when the Orcas were still out there. As the last few passengers scrambled into the lifeboats, Sarah looked back at the sinking Pacific Dream. The Orcas were gone now, their dorsal fins slipping beneath the surface as the ship finally began to sink into the deep, dark ocean. In the distance, the lifeboats bobbed on the water, the survivors staring back at the wreckage. The calm, serene waters they had once admired were now a nightmare. The silence was broken only by the distant sounds of the waves and the echoes of the terror they had just survived. But Sarah knew, deep down, that the fear would not end here. The memory of those eyes, cold, calculating, would haunt her forever. The boat shuddered again, the violent impact from below rattling the steel hull. Sarah gripped the railing with white-knuckled hands, staring at the water below her. It had been a few minutes since the Orcas first struck, and the situation was growing more dire with each passing second. She could see the dark water swirling around the ship's bow, and she knew in her gut that something was terribly wrong. These were not curious creatures. They were attacking. "Captain, we need to get out of here," Sarah called over her shoulder, her voice barely above a frantic shout. She glanced at the horizon, but there was nothing in sight. No other ships. No Coast Guard on the way. It was just the Pacific Dream and the pod of orcas closing in. Davis appeared from the crew quarters, his face drawn and pale. He didn't need to be told. The look in his eyes said it all. He had seen the damage, the cracks in the hull, the flooding in the lower decks, and knew that every second spent on this sinking ship brought them closer to disaster. "We need to get the passengers to the lifeboats now," Davis barked, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline pumping through his veins. His gaze shifted to Sarah. "You're in charge of getting the passengers to safety. I'll help with the lifeboats." Sarah nodded quickly, her heart pounding. She turned to the gathering crowd of tourists, panic already beginning to set in. They had been so excited just hours ago, eager to see the orcas up close, unaware of the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Now, they were screaming, pushing past each other, desperate to escape the growing terror. The ship tilted again, more sharply this time, as another impact rocked the boat. The sound of wood splitting echoed through the air, followed by the unsettling hiss of water rushing in through the cracks. "Get to the lifeboats," Sarah shouted, over the chaos, trying to keep her voice steady. She grabbed the arm of a woman near her, shaking her gently. "You have to move. Now." The woman looked at Sarah, wide-eyed and frozen in fear. She was clutching her child, both of them looking at Sarah like they couldn't process the situation. "It's not real," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." "It's real. You need to move," Sarah urged. She grabbed the woman by the shoulders, urging her toward the lifeboat. But the woman didn't budge. Panic surged through Sarah's chest. There was no time for this. "Do you want to die here? Move!" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she finally nodded, her grip tightening around her child. "We'll go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. As they moved toward the lifeboat, Sarah could hear the frantic shouts of the other passengers behind her. The orcas were circling the boat now, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like knives. The surface was calm, almost eerily so, but the tension was thick, suffocating. Another violent strike hit the boat's side. The entire ship seemed to lurch, and for a moment, Sarah's stomach dropped into her feet. She stumbled, but managed to steady herself against the railing. She heard a loud crack, then a scream. She whipped around to see a man, his body already halfway overboard. He had fallen into the water, and before anyone could react, one of the orcas appeared beneath him, slicing through the water with terrifying speed. "No! No!" Sarah screamed, her breath catching in her throat. She ran toward the railing, but by the time she reached it, the orca had already claimed its prize. The man's scream was cut off as the dark waters closed over him, leaving only ripples in the wake of the predator. She froze for a moment, staring into the water, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. It was too fast, too quick for anyone to do anything. There was nothing they could do. The orcas weren't just curious, they were hunting, and now they were taking the passengers one by one. "Sarah!" Davis shouted from behind her. He was at the lifeboat station, now trying to launch one of the emergency boats. "Get them to the damn lifeboats, now!" Sarah snapped out of her daze and ran toward him. Her mind was racing, her body moving on instinct. She grabbed the nearest life jacket and shoved it onto a young man who was still in a state of shock. His hands trembled as he tried to fasten it. "Put your life jacket on now," she shouted, her voice sharp. The boy nodded but barely seemed to hear her. His eyes were wide, filled with terror. Sarah turned and saw the ship listing more sharply now. The damage was extensive. She could hear the creaking of the hull as the water seeped in, the sound of flooding and splintering wood growing louder with every passing second. "We can't stay here," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him toward the lifeboat. "Sarah!" Davis shouted. He was struggling with the ropes, trying to release the lifeboat. "The hull's cracked. We don't have much time." A loud bang came from the lower decks, followed by the sound of the ship's engine sputtering. The lights flickered, and the boat shuddered again. Sarah could feel the vibrations of the orca's strikes through the hull now. Every blow sent a jolt through her bones, each one more forceful than the last. She looked around and saw more people being swept away, their screams filling the air only to be drowned by the roar of the orca's attacks. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She helped the boy into the lifeboat and turned to Davis. Go! Davis shouted, his voice strained. He cut the final rope and the lifeboat began to drift away from the sinking ship. The water around the Pacific Dream churned violently as the Orcas made their final strike. The boat groaned and creaked as the hull buckled, and then, with a gut-wrenching lurch, it began to sink. The lifeboats had barely cleared the ship when another massive strike hit the boat's stern. The Pacific Dream lurched forward, the bow dipping beneath the waves. The tourists in the lifeboat were silent, their faces pale and hollow. They stared at the wreckage of the ship as it was swallowed by the ocean, the once majestic vessel sinking into the abyss. The Orcas were still circling, their dark fins slicing through the water. But now the ship was gone. The hunt was over. Sarah looked around at the survivors. The woman with the child was clutching the boy tightly, her face pale. The young man who had nearly frozen up was now muttering to himself, his hands shaking uncontrollably. They were all in shock, none of them able to fully comprehend what had just happened, what they had just survived. The lifeboat drifted in the calm water, but the silence was deafening. The only sounds were the occasional splashes of the Orcas, as they moved away from the wreckage, their sleek bodies disappearing into the depths. They had done what they came for. And now, they were gone. Sarah's stomach churned as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving a hollow ache in her chest. She turned to look at the others, but no one spoke. No one knew what to say. The terror still hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating them all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the young man spoke. His voice was shaky, barely, above a whisper. What happened? Why did they attack us?" Sarah shook her head. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know why the Orcas had attacked. All she knew was that the calm, beautiful day they had started with had turned into a nightmare. And now, there was no going back. She looked out at the ocean, the vast, empty stretch of water that seemed to go on forever. The Orcas were gone, but their presence lingered, a shadow that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We just have to survive," she whispered. "That's all we can do now." The lifeboat bobbed on the open sea, the vast expanse of water stretching endlessly in every direction. Sarah could feel the salt water stinging her face as she held onto the side of the boat, her grip tight from the cold and the shock that still gripped her chest. Her mind replayed the attack over and over again. Those horrible moments of impact, the screams, the way the Orcas had struck with such precision. Her body trembled uncontrollably, but there was no time for weakness. Not now. "We can't just float here," she said, her voice hoarse from the strain. "We need to find land. Somewhere." A few of the survivors nodded weakly, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The woman with the child, the young man, the elderly couple, none of them spoke. Their silence was heavy, filled with the weight of trauma none of them had the words to describe. The only sound was the occasional slosh of the lifeboat as it drifted in the open water, the gentle rocking a cruel reminder that they were helpless in the vast, empty sea. "We're not going to last long out here," Sarah continued, her voice sharp. "The currents are strong, and without supplies—" She was cut off by a faint cough from the elderly man. He had been silent since the attack, his eyes unfocused as he stared at the horizon. But now his voice cracked the stillness. "Do you think they're gone?" he asked, his voice a brittle whisper. Sarah turned toward him. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken and tired. His wife, who had been clinging to him the entire time, rubbed his back gently, but her own expression mirrored the same confusion and fear. They were all just waiting for something they didn't understand. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly, her heart sinking. "I'm not sure if they'll come back, but we can't take any chances. We need to get to land." The boy who had frozen earlier, still clutching his life jacket like it was his lifeline, shifted uneasily. "How long will it take? To find land, I mean?" His voice cracked, the edge of desperation clear. "We'll have to see. The Coast Guard is miles away and we have no radio. We'll need to paddle," Sarah said, already knowing the grim reality of their situation. The Pacific Dream was long gone, its wreckage sinking beneath the surface, and the survivors were alone now. Their only hope was to make it to the shore, but there was no certainty, only the endless stretch of water. She took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and salty in her lungs. and steeled herself for the task ahead. She had to keep it together, for them. "All right, listen to me," she said firmly. "We need to work together. I know this is terrifying, but if we don't stay calm, we'll never make it." The survivors nodded, though their faces were etched with panic and disbelief. They had been through hell already. Sarah could see it in their eyes. The fear had taken hold, and they had no idea how to let it go. "We should start paddling," she said, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of land. "We don't know how far we are from the shore, but staying here is worse than trying to find it." Her eyes moved to the boy, whose hands were trembling violently. "Hey," she said, her voice softer now. "Take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this, but I need you to help. We all need to help." He nodded, but his eyes were still wide with terror, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of their situation. The elderly man spoke again, his voice weak. "What if we never make it? What if we're just drifting, waiting for something to happen?" Sarah looked at him, feeling the same fear rising in her chest. The reality was too harsh to ignore, but she couldn't show that fear. Not now, not in front of them. "We'll make it. We'll keep paddling until we do." The woman with the child, who had been silent for the longest time, spoke up, her voice shaking but filled with a quiet determination. "I don't care where we go as long as we get away from those things, please." Sarah nodded, feeling her heart twist with sympathy. "We will," she promised. She grabbed an oar and dipped it into the water, the coldness of the sea biting her skin. She began to paddle, slowly at first, unsure of the direction but determined to make progress. The others followed suit, though their strokes were uneven, their bodies stiff with fear and exhaustion. The minutes stretched into hours. Sarah lost track of time as the boat creaked and rocked under their weight. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie golden glow on the water, but it didn't feel peaceful. The silence was suffocating. The weight of the previous hours hung heavily over them, a constant reminder of what they had just survived. Every so often, one of the survivors would glance over the edge of the lifeboat, searching the water for any sign of danger. The orcas could be out there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. Sarah's thoughts kept returning to that horrible moment. The sight of the man being dragged under, the screams that had echoed in her ears. She had failed to save him. She had failed. Her breath quickened, and she had to force herself to focus. No time for grief. Not yet. The others needed her. They all needed to stay strong. "We need to stay focused," she called out, her voice firm despite the panic threatening to break through. "Keep paddling. We'll get through this." The elderly man cleared his throat and reached for an oar, though his hands shook. "What do you think happened?" he asked softly. "Why would they attack like that?" "Orcas aren't supposed to do that." Sarah's heart skipped. She didn't know. She had no answer for him. She couldn't even wrap her mind around it. She had always known orcas to be intelligent, even playful creatures, but their behavior today had been different. It had been predatory. "I don't know," she said finally, trying to push the thought away. "But we need to focus on surviving." The boy beside her began to sob quietly, his head bowed. "I didn't think I'd die today. I didn't think it would be like this." His voice cracked, raw with emotion, and Sarah's heart ached for him. The fear was overwhelming. The situation was beyond their control, and it was hard to imagine any way out. But she couldn't let herself show that doubt. Not now. Not when they all needed to believe that there was hope, even if it was only a faint glimmer on the horizon. "Hey," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're not giving up. I'm not giving up. You can't give up either. We have to stick together." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes, but he didn't look up. Sarah could see the weight of the situation settling on him, the realization of what they were up against. But they couldn't afford to fall apart. The hours dragged on, the sun sinking lower in the sky. The temperature dropped, and Sarah could feel the chill in her bones. Her muscles ached from the constant paddling, but there was no choice. They had to keep moving. "Do you think we're close to land?" the woman asked, her voice strained. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, trying to sound reassuring. "But we can't stop. We have to keep going." Just then the boy gasped, his eyes wide with shock. "Look! Over there!" Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned to follow his gaze. There, barely visible against the fading light, was a dark outline. Land. A stretch of coastline just on the edge of the horizon. Is it land? She whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The elderly man, squinting into the distance, nodded. I think it is. Then let's move, Sarah shouted, a surge of hope flooding through her. We're going to make it. Keep paddling. For the first time since the attack, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was the tiniest spark of hope. And she was, determined to make sure it didn't die out. The lifeboat surged forward, each stroke bringing them closer to the shore. The land in the distance was still far away, but it was there. They had a chance. They had to make it count. And so, they paddled on, one stroke at a time, each of them silently praying that the orcas were gone, and that the nightmare was finally behind them. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the lifeboat. The survivors, exhausted and fearful, sat huddled together, their bodies stiff from the cold and the constant rocking of the boat. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the dark water ahead, scanning for any signs of movement, but all she saw was the endless expanse of ocean. The land they had seen earlier was still far off, a distant promise they weren't sure they'd reach. The hours felt like days, and the only sound was the rhythmic splash of their paddles, the soft whisper of the water brushing against the hull. The group had fallen into a tense silence, the weight of the events pressing down on them. The orca's attack, the screams, the helplessness. It was all too much. Sarah could feel it, the heavy, suffocating air of dread that hung over them like a storm cloud. Do you think we're going to make it? The boy asked, his voice small, barely audible in the quiet. Sarah turned to him. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and streaked with salt water and tears. He had been quiet for hours now, but she could see the panic still in his gaze, the constant tremor in his hands. He was just a kid, and she knew he wasn't the only one terrified, but it was hard to comfort anyone when she herself wasn't sure if they would survive. We have to, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. We just need to keep going. The woman with the child, who had been holding her son tightly, her face drawn and exhausted, spoke up. How much longer? We've been paddling for so long, and that land, it's still so far away. Sarah turned her gaze toward the distant horizon. The outline of land was still there, just barely visible against the dark backdrop of the night sky. It seemed to shift and change with every wave, as though it were slipping further away from them, mocking their efforts. I know, Sarah replied, her throat tight. I know it feels like forever, but we'll get there. We just have to keep going. The old man, who had been quiet since they'd first set off, shifted in the boat, his hand clutching the side. He was staring at the water, his face pale under the faint light of the moon. What if it's too late? He muttered, almost to himself. What if we're already too far out? What if we don't survive this? Don't talk like that, Sarah snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. She took a breath, forcing herself to calm down. We're not giving up. Not now. We've made it this far. We just need to push through. But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her insides. The boat was small, vulnerable. The orcas could still be out there, lurking beneath the surface. Every time she glanced at the water, she half expected to see those massive fins slicing through the waves, the shadows of the killers waiting to strike again. The boy shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes darting nervously over the edge of the boat. I keep thinking I see something out there, he whispered, his voice trembling. In the water. Something moving. It's like they're still hunting. Sarah's stomach tightened. She turned to look, her eyes scanning the surface of the water. The moonlight reflected off the ripples, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of the ocean. I don't see anything, she said quietly, trying to reassure him. It's just the water. The waves play tricks on your eyes sometimes. But the boy didn't seem convinced. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them as if to shield himself from the very ocean that surrounded them. They're gone, the old man said suddenly, his voice soft but firm. The orcas. They're gone. We're not out here alone anymore. They've left us. The woman with the child didn't respond, but her eyes flickered nervously toward the water. It was clear that none of them truly believed that the threat had passed. The memory of those strikes, the sheer force and speed of the attack, was too fresh. It haunted them, and the silence of the night seemed to amplify the terror. "We don't know that," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "They could be waiting, lurking beneath us. We have to stay alert." "Please," the woman whispered, clutching her son closer. "I don't want to die out here. Please don't let them come back." The child whimpered softly, burying his face in his mother's arms. Sarah's heart ached for them. They had all been through so much already, and the weight of it was starting to crack them. The stress, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all too much. But they had no choice but to keep going. There was nothing else to do. Sarah turned her eyes back toward the horizon, trying to focus on the promise of land that still seemed so distant. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the pulse of fear in her chest. It was so quiet now, so eerie. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the calm water, the peaceful night, was too still. Suddenly, a loud splash broke the silence, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent a jolt of terror through Sarah's body. She whipped her head around, her heart pounding in her throat. The others were already staring wide-eyed at the water, their faces frozen in fear. "Did you hear that?" the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. The splash was distant, but it was unmistakable. Something had hit the water with tremendous force. Another splash, followed by a series of smaller ripples. Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked around, her mind racing, her pulse quickening. "Are they?" The woman's voice trailed off, fear written all over her face. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. She strained her eyes to see what was out there. But the darkness of the water swallowed everything. The orcas had been swift, brutal, and deadly before. Were they returning? Had they found them again? She swallowed hard, pushing away the thought, trying to stay calm. They had no time to panic. "Paddle," she ordered, her voice low but urgent. "Everyone, paddle, hard." The others didn't hesitate. They grabbed their oars, their hands shaking as they began to row. The boat jerked forward with each stroke, the sound of the paddles slapping the water seeming deafening in the tense silence. Sarah paddled with all her strength, her muscles burning, her heart racing. But then the sound came again, louder this time. A massive splash, followed by a deep, rumbling noise that reverberated through the boat. Sarah's stomach lurched. There was no mistaking it. The orcas were back. They were circling them, closing in. "They're coming," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're coming for us." Sarah's mind raced. The land was still too far away. The boat was small, too small to escape if the orcas decided to attack again. They were vulnerable, isolated, and completely at the mercy of the predators that circled them beneath the waves. "Keep paddling," Sarah shouted, her voice desperate now. "We need to get to land. Now! Hurry!" The lifeboat surged forward, but Sarah could hear the sound of the water growing louder. A massive shadow passed just beneath the boat, and the entire craft rocked violently, as though something massive had brushed against it. The survivors cried out in terror as the boat tilted dangerously, but they kept paddling, fighting the instinct to freeze in fear. Another massive splash, closer this time. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the boat rocked again, the violent surge of water sending a jolt through her body. She glanced down, her heart pounding in her chest. The water was dark and impenetrable, the surface rippling with the force of something powerful below. Keep paddling," she screamed, her voice raw with fear. The boat surged forward once more, but the water around them seemed to close in, growing darker, more menacing. They were out there, circling, and there was nowhere to go. They could try to outrun them, but would they make it? Would the land be too far to reach in time? And as the orcas' splashes grew louder, Sarah knew one thing. They weren't alone anymore. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The waves had grown larger, more unpredictable as the lifeboat tossed from side to side. The survivors paddled with everything they had left, their muscles burning, their bodies shaking with exhaustion. Sarah felt every ache, every scrape, every cold gust of wind that bit through her clothes. But none of it compared to the terror that clawed at her chest. The orcas were still out there just beneath the surface. She could feel it, the way the water seemed to pulse with their presence. "They're still following us," the boy said, his voice trembling. He was clutching his oar like a lifeline, but his eyes kept darting to the dark water, watching for any sign of movement. "I don't know," Sarah said, her throat dry. She wanted to say no to reassure him, but the truth was too ugly to admit. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, that the orcas were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The old man, who had barely spoken for the past several hours, suddenly coughed harshly, a deep rattling sound. He spat into the water, and his face was pinched with pain. "You okay?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the pallor of his skin. He looked worse than before, his breathing shallow, his movements slow and uncoordinated. Just an old man's cough," he muttered. But his voice was weak, and Sarah could tell that it was more than just that. He wasn't doing well. He hadn't been since the attack, and now out here on the open water his condition was deteriorating quickly. "We need to keep paddling," Sarah said, her voice tight, a hint of frustration slipping through. She felt like they were running out of time. The coast still seemed so far away, but the boy, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, whispered, What if they're already here? What if we don't make it?" "We're making it," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have to." The lifeboat creaked under the pressure, the sound of the oars digging into the water ringing in her ears. They weren't getting anywhere fast. The dark ocean seemed endless, stretching far beyond what her eyes could see. She had no idea how far they were from land anymore. Hours? Days? Time had lost meaning. All she knew was that they couldn't stop. They couldn't give in. Another splash. Louder this time. The boy jumped, his face paling further as his gaze snapped to the water. His voice was barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard it too. The sound of something massive hitting the water just beneath the surface. It was impossible to tell how far away it was, but she could feel it, like the pulse of a predator closing in. "Keep paddling," Sarah shouted, more urgently this time. Her voice broke through the fear, but it wasn't enough to calm the others. She glanced over at the woman who was still clutching her child tightly, her face pale with terror. She didn't have to say anything. The woman was already paddling, her strokes shaky but determined. Sarah didn't know if she could keep going much longer. They were all running on fumes. Every stroke felt like it took twice the effort, their strength slowly draining from them. Another splash, closer this time. "They're circling us," the boy said, his voice breaking. "They're coming closer." The water around them seemed to shift, the darkness beneath more menacing. Sarah's eyes darted nervously, but she saw nothing, only the empty, vast ocean that surrounded them. "They're not close," Sarah said, though her voice trembled with doubt. She didn't believe the words herself, but she had to say something to keep them moving. "They're gone, they've gone, we're not—" A tremendous jolt shook the lifeboat, sending a wave of panic through the survivors. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as the boat rocked violently. The boy screamed, his hand slipping from the oar, and Sarah grabbed him, holding him steady. "Hold on!" Sarah shouted. "Don't let go!" Another strike, this one much harder, and the boat tilted dangerously to the side. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped. The boat was going to capsize, she was sure of it. But just as quickly, as the strike came, it was gone. The water settled, but the boat was listing, and Sarah knew the orcas were not gone. They were just waiting for the right moment. "They're back," the woman whispered, her voice trembling as she pulled her child closer. "They're coming back for us." Sarah's eyes flicked to the water, but all she saw was the rippling surface, the blackness stretching beneath them. She couldn't see them, but she knew they were there. She could feel them circling beneath the boat like ghosts, moving with deadly precision, just out of sight. "They won't stop," Sarah muttered to herself, more to steady her own nerves than anyone else. She gripped the edge of the lifeboat, her knuckles white. "We can't stop. We keep moving. We don't stop. We just keep going." A scream split the air. Sarah whipped her head around to see the woman clutching her child, her face contorted in fear. The child was gone, disappeared beneath the water in an instant. "No!" the woman shrieked, throwing herself over the edge of the boat. My son? My son. Sarah didn't even hesitate. She reached out, grabbing the woman by the arm, but the woman fought her, desperate to dive into the water. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, pulling her back with all her strength. "You can't! They'll get you too!" The woman screamed again, her hands clawing at Sarah's, her body writhing in the boat. "Let me go! Let me save him!" Sarah held her tight, trying to steady her, but she could feel her grip weakening. The woman was slipping, the weight of grief and terror consuming her. "We need to survive," Sarah shouted, her voice raw with emotion. "We have to survive. For him." But it was too late. The woman fell silent, her body going limp in Sarah's arms. The life had drained from her, and her face was vacant, a hollow look of defeat in her eyes. Sarah stared at her, her heart shattering, but she knew they had to keep going. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now, not when they were this close. The old man coughed again, the sound ragged and dry. Sarah turned to him, her heart sinking. His face was ashen, his skin clammy. He was struggling to breathe. "We need help," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We need to get him to land." But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The old man's eyes fluttered, and then he slumped over, his body going limp against the side of the boat. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "No, please." The boy began to sob, his hands covering his face. The woman's child was gone. The old man was gone. And it felt like everything was slipping away. Sarah's strength was nearly gone, and they were still so far from land. How much longer could they keep going? Another jolt. This time the boat rocked violently, and Sarah gripped the side, trying to steady herself. The others were frozen, their faces filled with terror as they realized what was happening. The orcas weren't just playing anymore. They weren't circling out of curiosity. They were hunting, and they were closing in. Sarah didn't know how long they could keep this up, but she knew they had to try. She had to keep them alive, had to keep them moving, even if it meant her own breaking point. And then, as the boat shook again, a new sound broke through the chaos, the sound of a motor. Far off, but it was there. She could hear it. "Help!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse, ragged. "Help us! Someone, please!" The sound grew louder, and hope surged through her chest. The Coast Guard. They were coming. They were going to make it. The orcas disappeared beneath the surface, vanishing into the depths, but Sarah didn't care. She didn't care about them anymore. She just wanted to survive. And she could feel it. The rescue, the lifeline that would save them from the hell they'd just endured. The sound of the motor grew louder, closer now. It was all she needed. Just one more push. "Help is coming," Sarah whispered to the survivors. "We're going to make it." And with that, they kept paddling, their strength renewed by the smallest glimmer of hope. The quiet hum of the Coast Guard's engines echoed in Sarah's ears as the lifeboat surged forward, pushed by the promise of rescue. She barely registered the soothing sounds of the motor cutting through the water. Her body was spent, every muscle screaming in exhaustion. But there was one thing keeping her upright now, the knowledge that they were finally being pulled out of the nightmare. The Coast Guard had arrived. They had made it. But even now, in the dim light of the fading moon, Sarah couldn't quite shake the dread that had settled into her bones. The orcas, their shadowy figures, their unrelenting pursuit. It felt like they could reappear at any moment. She looked over the side of the boat, half expecting to see those massive dorsal fins slicing through the water. But the ocean had fallen, silent, as if it too had been waiting for the end of the terror. "We're going to be okay," the boy beside her said, his voice shaky but full of tentative hope. He hadn't spoken much since the woman's child had been taken, or since the old man had died. But now he was clinging to this new lifeline. Sarah forced a weak smile, the first real one in days. "Yeah," she whispered, though part of her felt the same. Part of her didn't dare believe it yet. The worst had happened. The losses had been too great. She wasn't sure how long it would take to shake off the horror of the past several hours. The bodies of the dead still lingered in her mind. The woman, the old man, the boy's grief-stricken face. It was almost as if she had left pieces of herself behind with them. The boat's engine roared louder as it grew closer. The bright lights of the Coast Guard vessel appeared over the horizon, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the churning sea. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to feel the faint stirrings of relief. But only faint. "Hey," the boy said suddenly, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He looked out toward the distant Coast Guard ship. "They're coming for us, right?" Sarah nodded, though a part of her still held her breath. "They're coming. For us, help is here." The boy let out a shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had lifted off them. I didn't think we'd make it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought we were done for." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. He was pale, his eyes still wide with shock, but there was something else there now too. Something that wasn't just terror, it was relief. The kind of relief that came from surviving a nightmare. "Me neither," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if it was the truth. She didn't think any of them had really believed they would make it. The terror had been too real, the orcas too relentless. It had felt like they were playing a game with their lives, and yet somehow they were here. The Coast Guard vessel was almost upon them now, and Sarah could make out figures on board. She stood up in the lifeboat, her legs wobbling beneath, her knees threatening to give way. But she had to be strong now. She had to be. She couldn't let herself collapse yet. Not when there was still work to be done. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, her voice hoarse but loud enough to carry over the water. "We're here! We're here!" A figure on the deck of the Coast Guard boat looked toward them, and Sarah saw him raise his arm, signaling to the others. They were coming, closer. "Thank God," she heard the boy whisper behind her. "Thank God." Sarah nodded, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall. She hadn't allowed herself to cry, couldn't allow it. Not yet. She had to stay strong for them, for the boy, for the woman, for the memories of those who had been lost in the darkness of the sea. The Coast Guard's boat neared, the roar of its engine deafening now. The rescuers had already thrown a rope ladder down toward them, and Sarah felt her heart leap in her chest. They were going to make it. They were going to be okay. "Come on," Sarah said, her voice shaking with exhaustion as she turned toward the others. She gripped the side of the lifeboat, steadying herself as the boy clung to her side. The woman with the child was still silent, her grief weighing her down. Sarah knew she would never forget the look in that woman's eyes. The helplessness, the terror, the final surrender as her child was pulled beneath the water. It had been too much. But now was not the time for grief. Now was the time for survival. She turned to the boy. "Let's go. We're almost there." With trembling hands, they grabbed the rope ladder and began to climb, one step at a time, their bodies aching with every movement. The boy was ahead of her, pulling himself up with what little strength he had left. Sarah followed, her legs wobbling beneath her, her heart still racing in her chest. She could hear the lifeboat below them rocking in the waves, but she kept her focus on the ship above. "Help us!" Sarah shouted as she reached the top, pulling herself over the edge of the Coast Guard boat. A pair of strong hands reached down to grab her, pulling her into the safety of the ship. "Got you!" a voice called out, gruff and calm. "Hold on. We'll get you the medical attention you need." Sarah collapsed onto the deck, gasping for air. The boy was already there beside her, his body shuddering with the effort of climbing. The woman followed, her steps slow, reluctant. But she climbed, her face an unreadable mask of grief and exhaustion. "Welcome aboard," another voice said, this one softer. A Coast Guard medic crouched beside Sarah, his face concerned as he checked her pulse. "You're all lucky to be alive." "Lucky," Sarah repeated softly, her eyes searching the horizon. The memories of what they had been through still felt fresh in her mind. The orcas, the screams, the desperate paddling. They had been close to death so many times, but now somehow they had survived. "How many?" the medic asked quietly, his voice kind but tinged with sorrow. "How many did you lose?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had lost count. It didn't matter how many. It didn't matter who. What mattered was the few who were left, the ones who had made it through. We lost some, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. The woman, the old man, the child. The medic nodded, his face grim. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. We'll get you all taken care of. You're safe now. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She didn't know how to. The weight of the losses pressed down on her. The fear, the helplessness. They had all felt it. But in the end, they had made it. They were alive. The boy sat down beside her, his eyes wide and unfocused. Are we really safe now? He asked, his voice uncertain. Are the orcas gone? Sarah turned to him, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. They're gone, she said softly, though part of her wasn't sure she believed it. The ocean was vast and the orcas were hunters. They had survived, but that didn't mean the danger was truly over. It was over for now, at least. That had to be enough. One of the Coast Guard officers walked up to them, offering a bottle of water. We'll get you to shore soon. You'll be safe there. We'll contact your families. You're going to be okay. Sarah took the bottle, her hands shaking as she unscrewed the cap. She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her dry throat. She looked up at the officer, her eyes filled with gratitude, but there was something else there too. Something she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the trauma, or maybe it was just the quiet echo of the ocean still ringing in her ears. We made it, she whispered to herself. Not sure if she was trying to convince the boy or herself. We made it. The boat rumbled beneath their feet as the Coast Guard vessel turned, heading back toward shore. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the steady hum of the engine, the soft murmur of voices around her. They were safe now, but the ocean had taken a piece of them. One they could never get back. The Coast Guard vessel slowly made its way back toward shore, cutting through the calm waters with a steady hum. The survivors sat huddled in the corner, their faces pale and haunted by what they had just endured. The woman, still silent, held her child close to her chest, her eyes distant and unfocused. The boy sat with his knees drawn to his chest, staring at the water with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. Sarah, though physically spent, couldn't shake the weight in her chest. The silence was suffocating. No one spoke. No one could. There was nothing left to say. The crew moved quietly around them, offering water and blankets, but the survivors didn't respond. They were too far gone, too deep in their own thoughts to care about comfort now. The world had shifted in ways they didn't know how to process. What had started as a dream cruise had become a nightmare that had cost them so much. The boy finally broke the silence, his voice a ragged whisper. What happens now? His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. It was a question they all needed to ask, even if they didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. We survive, she said, though she wasn't sure she even believed the words anymore. How do you survive something like that? How do you move forward when the world had shattered around you in a matter of hours? The medic from the Coast Guard ship approached them, his expression soft but concerned. He had checked their vitals when they first boarded, but now, seeing them sitting in a state of numb exhaustion, he crouched down in front of them. We'll be at the harbor soon, he said, his voice gentle. I'm going to get you all checked over by our doctors as soon as we land. You'll be okay. Sarah nodded, but she wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. They had survived. Yes, but at what cost? The images of the attack still haunted her. Those massive black and white shapes circling beneath the boat, the sound of the splintering wood, the blood in the water, the faces of the people she had lost. The woman with the child, the elderly man, flashed before her eyes, and a cold wave of grief washed over her. Do you know if anyone else survived? The boy's voice trembled, and Sarah turned to look at him. His face was blotched with tears, his eyes hollow from the trauma, and she could feel the weight of his question. She didn't know. She didn't know if anyone else had made it out alive, and the thought twisted something deep in her gut. I don't know, Sarah said quietly. I wish I could say yes, but I don't. The boy lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as he tried to hold back sobs. We should have. We should have saved them. We should have done more. Sarah's heart broke for him. She knew what he meant. She had felt it too. Hadn't they all? The helplessness that had gripped them as they watched people disappear into the water, unable to save them. It had all happened so fast, the terror so overwhelming. They had done what they could, but it hadn't been enough. It wasn't your fault, Sarah said, her voice firm but soft. We did what we could. You can't blame yourself for something that wasn't in your control. The boy looked up at her, his tear-streaked face searching hers. How do you know? How do you live with it, knowing we didn't save them? Sarah took a deep breath, her chest tight as she thought of the others, the ones who hadn't made it. You don't, she whispered. You don't live with it. You learn to live despite it. The boy fell silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It seemed like a lifetime ago that they had been out on the water, so hopeful and naive, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. Now the boy, who should have been carefree and full of life, was just another survivor trying to make sense of a tragedy that no one should ever have to face. The woman, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, broken, as if the words had been locked inside her for too long. I should have fought harder. I should have tried to save my son. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. Sarah's stomach twisted as she realized the woman's grief was consuming her. You couldn't have, Sarah said, her voice soothing but firm. None of us could have stopped them. It wasn't your fault. The woman's eyes, once filled with love for her child, were now hollow. Empty. I couldn't even protect him. Her words were barely above a whisper. I didn't even get to say goodbye. The sadness in her voice cut through Sarah's heart. She had seen death before, but nothing had ever felt like this. The utter finality of it, the complete absence of choice. The way the world had turned upside down in an instant, leaving only devastation in its wake. The medic gave them a moment of silence before speaking again, his voice kind and understanding. We're approaching the harbor now. There's a team waiting for you. They'll take care of everything. Sarah nodded, but the thought of going back to civilization, to the lives they had left behind, filled her with dread. How could they ever go back to normal after what they'd seen? The world felt different now, darker, more dangerous. She wasn't sure how to explain it to the people who hadn't been there, who hadn't lived through the terror of the open ocean. They wouldn't understand. The boy finally spoke again, his voice small but determined. What happens now? After we get to shore, what do we do? Sarah hesitated, the answer so much harder to give than it should have been. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know what happens now, but we're alive, and that's enough for now. The Coast Guard vessel slowed as they neared the harbor, the lights of the dock growing brighter. The sound of the engine quieted, replaced by the distant hum of activity on the shore. A small group of emergency responders was waiting for them, their faces grim as they took in the sight of the survivors. There were no cheers, no relief in the air, only the stark reality of what had happened. The boat docked and the survivors were helped off, their legs shaky as they made their way onto solid ground. The boy, still clinging to Sarah, looked out at the world they were returning to. The shore was quiet, the people on the dock staring at them with concern and confusion. They were alive, but they were also changed. How could they ever explain what had happened? How could they ever live with the knowledge of what they had survived? Sarah didn't have the answers. She didn't know how they would move forward. The orcas were gone, but their memory would stay with them forever. The ocean had taken so much, and it had left them with scars that would never fade. The medic led them toward a waiting ambulance, his hand resting gently on Sarah's shoulder. We'll take care of you, he said, his voice steady. You're going to be okay. Sarah nodded, though she didn't know if she could believe those words. But she didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to. They had survived, and that was all that mattered now. The rest, whatever came next, was something they would have to face together. As the medic led them toward the ambulance, Sarah glanced back at the harbor, the lights of the shore reflecting off the calm water. For a moment it felt like the ocean had swallowed everything, her hopes, her dreams, the people she had lost. But the survivors were still here, still breathing, still fighting to stay afloat. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The Coast Guard boat glided toward the dock, its engine's steady hum filling the quiet space between Sarah and the others. The boy beside her shifted uncomfortably, his eyes never leaving the dark water below them. He was exhausted, just like everyone else, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted in him, just as it had in Sarah. No one would ever be the same after what they had survived. Sarah barely felt the rocking of the boat beneath her. Her body was numb, worn down by the ordeal. She had kept going through, sheer willpower. But now, with the harbor coming into view, a sense of dread settled over her. The world they had left behind, before the attack, before the terror on the ocean, seemed a lifetime away. She didn't know how to return to it, how to face the people who would ask questions, who would want explanations. How could she explain the horrors they had faced? The woman, still clutching her child's lifeless body to her chest, didn't look up. Her face was pale, almost gray under the dim light. She had been in shock for hours, barely speaking, only moving when prompted. Sarah had tried to offer comfort, but there was nothing to say to her. There were no words for the unbearable loss she was suffering. "What now?" the boy finally asked, his voice breaking through the silence. He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide and lost. "What happens when we get there? What happens when we get to shore?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to answer. The shore was a blur of lights as the Coast Guard boat finally docked, the sound of the engine dying down to a low murmur. The first thing Sarah noticed was the cold air that hit her skin as soon as she stood, the rush of it almost sharp, a stark contrast to the humid heat they'd endured at sea. She barely noticed the responders waiting for them on the dock. Uniformed, grim, their faces a mixture of relief and concern, as they helped her out of the boat. She could barely find the strength to move, her legs stiff, but she followed their instructions and climbed carefully onto the concrete. The boy was already there beside her, his face streaked with salt water and tears, his gaze darting nervously around as though he couldn't quite believe they were back. The woman, still holding her child, barely moved. She didn't even seem to register the voices around her, the gentle hands pulling her toward the ambulances. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, trying to clear the salty residue of the ocean from her skin. The moment her feet hit the solid ground, it was as if a wave of exhaustion hit her full force. It was no longer just physical fatigue. There was a deep, unshakable weariness, an overwhelming emotional toll she wasn't sure how to process. "We need to get you checked out," one of the paramedics said gently, but his tone was laced with a kind of reserved urgency. He moved toward the woman first, his hands soft but insistent as he tried to get her to relinquish the child's body, but she shook her head sharply, refusing to let go. "No," she whispered, her voice broken. He's still my son. We can't help him, ma'am," the medic said quietly. "We need to take him and help you." The woman collapsed against the medic's chest in a rush of grief, her face hidden, her body shaking as sobs racked her fragile frame. Sarah felt the weight of it in her own chest, the crushing sadness that seemed to echo through her own broken heart. She had survived, yes, but what did that mean now? What was the point of surviving if the cost was so high? The boy's gaze flickered to the woman, and Sarah could see his eyes brimming with tears as he looked down at the woman's lifeless child. He wanted to say something, anything to ease her pain, but he knew the words were useless, just as Sarah did. "Let's get you to the ambulance, all right?" the medic said, leading the woman gently toward the waiting vehicle. His voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the strain in it, the understanding of how utterly powerless they all were in the face of such profound loss. Sarah started to move toward the ambulance, but the boy stopped her. His small hand gripped her arm, his eyes wide with raw emotion. "Are they going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Are we going to be okay?" Her heart ached for him. He was just a child, and the world had shattered around him. "I don't know," she said softly, the words tasting like acid in her mouth. She wanted to lie, to promise him something that could make this all better, but she couldn't. She wasn't sure she believed in anything better anymore. The paramedics led them into the ambulance, the interior dim and sterile, the smell of antiseptic in the air. Sarah sat in one of the back seats, the boy beside her. He hadn't said a word since they climbed in. He was staring blankly at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. As the ambulance started its slow journey toward the nearest hospital, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if it was even worth going back to civilization. What would they say? How would they explain the wreckage of the boat, the bloodshed, the horrors of the ocean? No one would believe them. No one would understand. You did everything you could, the medic said, sitting down opposite them. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight of sincerity. You survived. That's something, you know. Sarah glanced at him, but she didn't feel reassured. She didn't feel anything but a hollow emptiness, a chasm that had opened up in her chest ever since they'd been pulled from the ocean. I don't feel like we did everything we could, she said, her voice small. People died. People I couldn't save. You're not responsible for what happened, the medic said, his tone more forceful now, though there was a gentleness to it. You can't blame yourself for that. No one could have predicted what happened. Those orcas, no one could have stopped them. Sarah blinked rapidly, pushing back the tears that threatened to surface. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Her brain kept replaying the moments she couldn't undo. The woman's scream, the child slipping into the water, the helpless look in the elderly man's eyes as his life faded away. The boy shifted beside her, his voice small and fragile. I'm scared, he admitted. His voice cracked, the weight of everything they'd been through crashing down on him in a rush. I know, Sarah whispered, her throat tight. She turned to look at him, her gaze softening. I'm scared too. But we're alive. We're still here, and we'll figure this out. I promise. The boy nodded, though Sarah could tell he didn't fully believe her. She didn't blame him. How could he? How could anyone after everything they had witnessed? The hospital loomed in the distance as the ambulance approached. Sarah could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the hum of activity as they reached the entrance. It felt almost like a dream, a blur of motion of people running toward them preparing to help. But none of it felt real. It felt like they had entered a new world, one where nothing made sense anymore. The ocean had taken so much from them. How could anything ever be the same again? As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, a pair of paramedics rushed forward to meet them, their faces strained with urgency. Sarah didn't know what to do, where to look. She was too tired, too broken to move. Ma'am, one of the paramedics said as they helped Sarah out of the ambulance, guiding her toward the hospital doors. We're going to take care of you now. You're safe. The words hung in the air like a cruel joke. They weren't safe. They hadn't been for a long time. The terror on the water still lingered in their minds, gnawing at them, refusing to let them forget. The boy was led off to another part of the hospital, his small hand gripped by a nurse as she guided him to a room where he could be checked. Sarah's eyes followed him for a moment, her heart aching for what he had lost. But she didn't have the strength to follow. She couldn't. She stood in the waiting area, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind numb. The world outside seemed too far away, too distant. The ocean, the nightmares, the lives lost. They all felt so far removed from this sterile hospital space. One of the nurses came to her, her face softening with concern. You need to rest, ma'am. Let us take care of everything. You're safe now. Sarah nodded numbly, her chest tight, and let herself be led down the sterile hallway. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, but she kept moving, one step at a time, as if that would be enough to keep her from breaking. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough. The ocean had taken too much, but she would keep going just as she had before. She had no choice. They all did. They had to survive, even if the ocean had stolen their peace. Even if they would never be the same. The hospital room was sterile, almost suffocatingly so, with its bright white walls and the sharp smell of antiseptic in the air. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her legs dangling, her hands gripping the edge of the sheets. She had never been so exhausted in her life. The events of the last few days were still swirling in her head, a chaotic mess of screams, violence, and helplessness that she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried. The quiet of the hospital should have been a relief, but it felt like an insult. The calmness here only highlighted the storm that still raged in her mind. The door to her room creaked open, and a nurse stepped in. She was young, with a soft, empathetic face, her expression gentle as she checked Sarah's vitals. Sarah barely looked up at her. The nurse had been in several times already to check on her, but Sarah hadn't spoken much to her, hadn't said much of anything at all. It didn't seem to matter. The nurse did her job without pressing for more than Sarah was willing to give. "You're doing okay?" the nurse said softly, after a few moments of checking Sarah's heart rate and blood pressure. "I'm going to go check on the boy, see how he's doing. You just rest, okay?" Sarah nodded absently, watching the nurse leave. Her mind was still stuck on the boy, the only other survivor of the Orca attack and the woman who had lost everything. She couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, the blank, hollow look in her eyes as she clutched her dead child. It was something that would stay with her, something that couldn't be erased. She rubbed her hands over her face as though trying to wipe away the images, but it didn't work. They were burned into her mind. The sounds, the faces, the cold, indifferent water that had taken so much from them. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. How could she ever move forward when it felt like a part of her was still trapped out there in the ocean, lost with those who had perished? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She didn't bother to look up. She was too tired, too drained to care who it was. But the door opened, and she heard the familiar footsteps of the boy entering the room. She felt him, before she saw him, the weight of his presence, the quiet way he entered, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the room. "Hey," he said, his voice small but steady. Sarah turned to face him, and she couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. He was still a child, but there was a certain gravity about him now, something that had been forged in the fire of their shared ordeal. "Hey," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse. She wanted to say more, to ask how he was doing, to offer him comfort, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. He stood there for a moment, unsure, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was a resilience in his eyes that Sarah couldn't ignore. She could see it now, the strength that he had somehow found amidst the chaos. They had both survived. They were still here. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I should have helped more. I should have tried harder to save them." Sarah shook her head quickly, standing up from the bed and walking over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor in his body as he stood before her. His head lowered in guilt. "No," she said firmly. "You did everything you could, we all did. You can't blame yourself for what happened. I could have done more," he whispered, his voice breaking. I froze. I couldn't move." "You were scared," Sarah said, her voice softening. "We all were. It's not easy to act when you're terrified, but you did what you could, and that's enough." The boy looked up at her then, his eyes filled with raw emotion, and for a moment Sarah saw him as he truly was, a young boy thrust into a nightmare beyond his understanding. She wanted to promise him that everything would be okay, that the nightmares would fade and they would heal. But she couldn't. She didn't know if she believed that herself. "I keep thinking about them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The woman and her son, they're gone." Sarah's throat tightened. The woman and her son, the faces that would never leave her. She had lost her own family years ago, but she had never experienced anything like this. Not the way she had watched someone else lose everything right in front of her. It was an ache that would never go away, a wound too deep to ever fully heal. "I think about them too," Sarah admitted quietly, her gaze drifting to the window, the daylight filtering through the blinds in soft rays. "But you know what? We're still here. We made it." The boy didn't respond, but he gave a small nod, as if trying to accept what she had said, trying to find some measure of comfort in her words. He hadn't had time to process everything, just like she hadn't. They had been swept into a violent storm that had come out of nowhere, leaving them grasping for survival. But now, in the aftermath, All they had left was each other and the memory of those they had lost. The silence between them was comfortable now, but it felt fragile, like something that could break if they pressed too hard. Sarah wasn't sure what to say next. She didn't know how to help him or herself. They were both lost, floating in the wreckage of what had happened. "I keep seeing it," the boy said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "The water, the orcas, the way they just came after us." His eyes were wide, distant, and Sarah could see the terror still clinging to him, even in the safety of this room. "I keep thinking they're going to come back, that they're still out there." "They're not out there," Sarah said firmly, though she didn't fully believe it herself. The memory of the orcas' massive, sleek bodies, the way they had attacked with such precision, it felt like a warning, like something that couldn't be easily forgotten. The ocean had a way of taking and giving back in ways that were beyond their control. "They won't come back, we're safe now." But the boy only shook his head. "I don't know if I can ever feel safe again." Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She didn't have an answer for him. She didn't know how to make him feel better, how to undo what had been done. She didn't know how to make her own fear go away either. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their quiet moment, and Sarah looked up as a doctor entered the room. He was tall, with a kind but weary face. He seemed to know what he was walking into. Two survivors who had been through a trauma that most would never experience. "Sarah," he said gently, his voice soft but authoritative, "we need to run a few more tests. You've been through a lot, and we need to make sure you're physically all right." Sarah nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The boy glanced at her, his face filled with uncertainty. He didn't want her to leave. She could see it in his eyes. "I'll be back soon," Sarah said softly, giving him a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You'll be okay. I'll be right here." The boy nodded but said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. Sarah knew how he felt. They both felt the weight of the world on their shoulders, the trauma they carried too heavy to be expressed in words. As she walked with the doctor down the hallway, she glanced back at the boy, watching him as he sat there, his body slumped, staring into space. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or the day after that. The world outside seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of everything they had lost. But they had survived. They were still here. And for now, that had to be enough. The rest, whatever it was, could wait. The hospital room felt colder now, despite the warmth from the overhead lights. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on the floor. She hadn't spoken much in the last few hours, barely able to find the energy to respond to the doctors or the paramedics who had come in to check on her. She was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of what had happened. Her mind couldn't keep up with her emotions, and she was drowning in a sea of confusion and grief. She had survived. They had survived. But what now? What was the point of surviving if the cost was too high? What was left when the lives of others were taken so violently and without mercy? The door to her room creaked open, and she didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was the boy. He'd been coming in and out of her room all afternoon, his face a mixture of exhaustion and unspoken pain. Every time, he looked like he was trying to make sense of it all, like he was looking for answers that Sarah didn't have. "Hey," he said softly, standing in the doorway. His voice was small, tentative, as though he wasn't sure if she wanted him there. "I just wanted to check on you." She finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night they were rescued, now torn and stained, a silent reminder of what they had been through. His face had changed since they were pulled from the water, the fear still lingering in his eyes but softened with a new kind of exhaustion. "I'm fine," she replied quietly, her voice hoarse. It wasn't the truth, but she couldn't bring herself to admit how far from fine she really was. The boy didn't move closer. He just stood in the doorway, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his eyes searching her face for something, anything that might reassure him. But Sarah didn't know how to reassure him or herself, for that matter. The words felt hollow, as if nothing she said would make a difference. "I keep thinking about it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "About the orcas. About the woman, and her son, and the old man. Sarah's heart clenched. She could feel the boy's pain, his confusion. He hadn't been the only one struggling with the grief of losing others, but it seemed harder for him, like he had not only lost people but also a part of himself. Something he couldn't quite name. They're all gone. The boy continued, his eyes on the floor. And I couldn't do anything to save them. Sarah pushed herself up from the bed and walked toward him. She didn't know what to say at first. She had no answers. For him, nothing that would take away the heaviness in his chest or the guilt that was weighing him down. You did everything you could, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. She placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to convey some measure of comfort. You couldn't have done more. We were all in the same boat. It wasn't your fault. The boy looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. His lips trembled and he fought to hold back another wave of emotion. I keep thinking, if I had just done something differently, maybe I could have saved them. Maybe it wouldn't have ended the way it did. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. You can't keep doing this to yourself, she said gently. It wasn't your fault. You can't change what happened, no matter how much you wish you could. You can't live in that moment forever. He shook his head, his expression torn. But I can't stop thinking about it. I keep seeing it in my head. The woman, her son, the old man, the way they were taken. It doesn't make sense. It's like it was all a bad dream, but it was real. And I couldn't do anything. I know, Sarah whispered. I know it feels like that. But you have to understand, you didn't fail. You survived. We all survived. That's what matters now. The boy's shoulders shook slightly and he looked down, biting his lip. I don't feel like I survived, he muttered, his voice cracking. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel right. Sarah's heart broke for him, for the weight of the grief and trauma that was consuming him. She wanted to tell him it would get easier, that one day the memories would fade, but she couldn't lie to him. The truth was, she didn't know how to move on. How could they? How could anyone? Maybe it never will feel right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe some of this, some of what happened, will always be with us. But we have to keep going. That's all we can do. He met her eyes then, his gaze searching hers for some semblance of hope, of strength. Sarah didn't know if she had any of those things left to offer, but she forced a small smile. You'll make it through this, she said softly. We both will, one step at a time. The boy looked at her for a long moment as if trying to gauge her sincerity. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and nodded, though his eyes still carried the weight of everything he had experienced. Do you think they'll ever believe us? He asked, his voice uncertain. About the Orcas? About what happened? Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes lowering as she considered his question. She wasn't sure if she even believed it herself, but she knew that the world would never fully understand what had transpired on that boat. The terror, the relentless strikes, the way the Orcas had attacked with such purpose. It was something that would remain in their minds long after the world moved on. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if they'll ever believe us, but that doesn't matter, does it? What matters is that we know the truth. We were there, we survived, and we'll keep going. The boy nodded slowly, though the doubt still lingered in his eyes. He looked like he was trying to understand what it meant to survive after something so horrific. He looked like he was trying to find a way to breathe again after the storm. We have to keep living, right? He asked quietly. Even though it hurts? Yes, Sarah said firmly, her voice steady now. We have to. It's the only choice we have. There was silence between them for a few moments, the kind of silence that was filled with unspoken words and raw emotion. The boy took a deep breath, then wiped his eyes again. He seemed to be trying to pull himself together, trying to find the strength to move forward, just like Sarah. I don't want to forget, he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. I don't want to forget what happened. I don't want to forget them. The ones we lost. Sarah's heart twisted in her chest. She didn't want to forget either. The faces, the screams, the way the water had swallowed everything. It was all burned into her mind. But she knew deep down that holding on to that pain forever wasn't the answer. It was a weight that would crush them both if they didn't learn to carry it. "I don't think we ever will forget," Sarah whispered. "But we can choose how we carry it. We can choose to move forward even with the pain." The boy nodded again, this time more firmly, as if Sarah's words had anchored something in him. He didn't look as broken as he had when he walked in, but there was still a quiet sadness in his eyes. Sarah knew that would never go away. It couldn't. But maybe, just maybe, they could learn to live with it. "We'll make it," Sarah said, her voice quiet but determined. "We'll make it through this." The boy gave her a small, uncertain smile, and for the first time since they had been rescued, Sarah believed it too. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held, but they had each other, and they were still alive. And for now, that had to be enough.